Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this presentation. My name is Nathan Snow. I'm from the USDA National Wildlife Research Center. I'm going to talk today about movements of wild pigs relative to bait sites. And I just want to start out by acknowledging my co-authors that are from the USDA National Wildlife Research Center, from the U.S. Forest Service, and from the University of Georgia. And so I'm going to be discussing two separate studies they're separate but related on how pigs responded to bait on the landscape. And the goal here is to inform more effective population control through population removal using baiting. Okay, so why do we bait pigs? Well, as I said, it's for population control. We want to reduce damage to agricultural and natural resources. We also want to reduce the geographic expansion of pigs. If you look in the map below, the red area is where pigs are or are likely to exist in the next 50 years. And we need to remove about 50 to 60% of the population of pigs annually to try to keep the population stable. And so we use bait for population control, particularly for trapping. And sometimes we shoot pigs over bait. And then in the future, hopefully soon, we'll have another tool which will be toxic baiting. So bait can be a science of its own. There are all kinds of concoctions. And if you, some of these images are actually from Pinterest. You can Google pig baits and get all kinds of different recipes that people are using. I just want to say, for the sake of this study, we just used whole kernel corn because we know that works pretty well for pigs, and we didn't want to have some of these confounding factors of different types of attractants with our bait. Our objectives with combining the two studies and to making this presentation were threefold. We wanted to determine how pigs respond to bait placement, with emphasis on trying to achieve consistent or reliable visitation by pigs. And that consistency is important, especially when you're trying to conduct whole sounder removal where you don't want to leave any pigs on the landscape. Or it's really important for when you're toxic baiting pigs, because we're going to need to be using a bait station, which pigs need to have time to learn how to use this bait station that protects the toxic bait from any other non-target animals, but pigs will learn to use it. Our second objective was to determine how pigs shift their movements in response to baiting. And thirdly, to develop some best practices for baiting wild pigs. So study one that I'll talk about took place in two locations in Texas, USA. The first southern study area was about 22,000 acres. It was located in Texas Hill Country, and this is primarily a forested landscape. In the north study area, it was in rangeland and agricultural matrix. It was about 11,000 acres. Our methods for these studies were to first capture and collar some wild pigs. We put GPS collars on 75 adults. 7 of those collars either slipped off or were killed before we could start the study. So we ended up with 68, 36 on females and 32 on males. So the methods for baiting wild pigs, we initially deployed 104 bait sites in areas with fresh sign that we thought would be good for pigs. This turned out to be about 1 bait site per 0.75 kilometers squared. And then we narrowed down those 104 to 61 of the best bait sites that had good visitation by pigs. We broke our baiting into 3 different periods. We had 15 days pre-baiting, which actually we had the pigs collared, but we didn't have any bait on the ground yet. And then we had 15 days during baiting, which we put out about 25 pounds of corn at the bait site every single day. And then that was followed by 15 days of post-baiting, where we weren't putting any corn out anymore, but we were monitoring the pigs still with the GPS collars. And we separated each of these periods by about 6 days to make sure that we didn't have any residual effects from any of the seasons or any of the periods before heading into the next period. We evaluated pig movements relative to bait sites. We looked at the probability of them visiting a bait site at least one time. We looked at the daily rate of repeated visitation. We looked at their hourly movement distances, and then we looked at their home ranges, and particularly how these home ranges shifted. So I'll jump right into the results. Here on the x-axis, we have the average distance that wild pigs were located to a bait site. And then on the y-axis, we have the probability of visiting a bait site. And so you can see right away for both males and females that the probability of them visiting a bait site declined the farther away that the bait was from where they lived. So you can also see that males tended to have a higher probability of visiting a bait site than females did. And if our goal with our baiting is to try to achieve at least 50% or greater chance of a pig visiting our bait site one time, we need to put our bait sites within about 1.75 kilometers for females and 2.25 kilometers for males to make sure that those animals visit the bait site. So here's a similar graph, except that the y-axis is now the daily rate of visitation. And you can see here similarly that daily rate declined at the farther away that you put the bait site from where wild pigs live. And so if the goal here again is to try to achieve greater than 50% daily visitation rate, that means that we need to put our bait sites within about 1 kilometer from where pigs live to have them be repeated visitation every day. Okay, and now talk about some results with home ranges. Here we have the 3 different periods on the x-axis, and then the average distance to the nearest bait site from the centroid of their home range on the y-axis. And so the distances stayed pretty stable through the baiting period, but then when baiting ended, I find it kind of interesting that that the wild pigs shifted away from the baited area. Okay, and so I'm going to come back to that study when I start talking about implications, but I'll start here on study 2, which has some similar findings. And so this study took place in South Carolina and Texas. In South Carolina, we had 2 different resource types identified, or that were the study areas. The first was a high resource area, which was a landfill site. The second was a low resource area, which was a mixed forest. And then we also had the Texas Hill Country site, which we felt like had moderate resources. And so we had similar methods in this study where we collared 64 pigs and we followed similar baiting methods. And so I'll jump right into the results on this. This graph here, we have the probability of visiting a bait site at least once on the y-axis, and the number of bait sites in the home range prior to baiting in the x-axis, and then the probability of visiting at least once on the y-axis. And so the probability of visiting a bait site increased with the number of bait sites in the home range. And the Texas site, which is blue, had the largest initial probability of a visit, which was around 94% for one bait site. And I think that this could have been related to these pigs being pretty willing to go to bait because they have very little removal pressure in this landscape. In the area with low resources, which was the line with the red, the probability of at least one visit was only 0.4, likely because pigs were at lower densities in this area. And then this model, I think another important thing to show or to say is that this model shows there's an upper limit to what we can reach on maximizing visitation for all habitat types. At values beyond 10 bait sites in a home range, there was no further increase in the probability of a visit for any of the 3 sites. And so then, how quick did these pigs visit? I have 2 graphs here. On the y-axis is the day of first visit for both graphs. The graph on the left is distance to the nearest bait site prior to baiting. And then on the right is home range size prior to baiting. And this shows that pigs with home range centroids located closer to bait and with larger home ranges visited bait earlier. There was no difference between males and females in the time to visitation. And on average, pigs visited a bait site as early as 2.6 days or as late as 8.5 days. How many bait sites did a pig visit? On average, pigs with 5 bait sites in their home range visited 2 bait sites, and pigs with 10 bait sites in their home range visited 3. And I think this is important to show that bait site visitation does not increase linearly with bait availability. But the overall number of bait sites visited remained low despite large increases in the number of available bait sites. And so then the last question we asked you was how far did they go to get to a bait site? And on average, which was quite similar to the first study I talked about, the average from all 3 study areas was 1.46 kilometers that they went from the centroid of their home range to a bait site. But this distance was shorter for the high resources landfill site, was 0.92 kilometers. In the low resources mixed forest in South Carolina, it was farther. It was 2.81, and then in the moderate resources, it landed right in the middle of there at 1.57. So bringing together both of these studies to create some implications on how pigs responded to bait. Baiting caused some shifts in the home ranges. Pigs moved closer to the bait during the baiting while bait was out. And they went, after baiting was done, they moved away from the baited area into new space. It may take about 3 to 6 days for pigs to find a bait site, even if it's in their home range. The closer that you can place the bait to where these pigs are spending their time, the more likely you are to have good repeated visitation. And there's some evidence that, especially in Texas, that males visited more readily than females did. This is likely owing to their more, they use larger space and are a little bit more nomadic than some females are. So those implications and all the results together can lead us to some best baiting practices, which I think are important to talk about. The first, I think it's important to stress is that I think we should pretty much always use more bait sites than we anticipate needing if our goal is to try to remove pigs. Pigs only visited on average 2 out of 5 bait sites, even if those bait sites were within their home ranges. So we might need a few bait sites per home range to ensure that every pig that's on the landscape is getting targeted with our bait. If we also need to place bait within about 1 kilometer of where pigs live to make sure that we get good, reliable visitation. And I mentioned that reliable visitation is going to be really important for whole sounder removal and for toxic baiting. And if we're not getting good, reliable visitation, I think within about 3 to 6 days, if pigs aren't coming back consistently, it's worth just relocating that bait site to a new area where you're getting them to visit consistently. And I also think it's really important to consider the resources that you're in when you're baiting pigs. If it's a poor resource area, pigs are going to travel farther to your bait sites. And if it's a good resource area, pigs might stay close. So your bait sites might need to be more densely packed into a good resource area to make sure that you're targeting the entire population. And so I just want to put these citations up here for both of those studies if you're looking for more information, or my email is here too, and I'd be willing to take any questions that you might have. And thank you for watching.